The root of egalitarianism is that it started with an ancient desire for oneness with the divine. This is demonstrated by the writings of Hesiod and Plato. Hesiod talks of a golden age when there was no hierarchy between men and the gods lived among men. The Jews have a similar story to this in the Garden of Eden myth. The Greek Golden Age ends and an age of hierarchy begins. This idea is seen again in a degenerated form in that of Plato, where the guardian class are portrayed as living communally and ascetically. This idea of an ideal egalitarian society is seen later in history during the Renaissance in Thomas More's novel Utopia. And Renaissance Italy was to a large degree a very aristocratically oriented society. This idea cannot be blamed on modernity or Marxism or liberalism or even Christianity. This idea already existed even in the classical Greek world. The reason for this idea is that the aristocracy wished to go beyond their hierarchy and transcend it. The issue is that it is not possible to do this, because if you abolish hierarchy, you just end up with either a different hierarchy or worse, you could end up in a communal society. Communal societies can be glorified by some, but they actually tend to be some of the most dystopian societies ever envisioned. They tend to have very little formal hierarchy, but still have an informal hierarchy, which involves catering to the egos of the individuals who have higher status unofficially. In other words, the favorites who everyone looks up to will usually have almost unlimited power, and the society functions through gossip and group shaming. In other words, anarchist communes tend to turn into obnoxious neighborhoods where everyone is in each other's business and no privacy or alone time is ever possible. And rumors spread fast and never go away. Essentially, living on an anarchist commune is just like living in a village or a suburb where everyone knows each other. Often they know each other too well. These societies tend to be dominated by the most obnoxious and envious elements, and the great and the strong tend to have their spirits crushed in these environments. This environment tends to be extremely traditional and oriented towards maintaining norms as the ultimate goal. Things like truth do not matter to this society, only collective consensus matters. It tends to be the rule of weaker and more obnoxious people, while those with a disposition oriented towards strength, genius, and individuality tend to not fare too well. This leads to the question, why is it that this tendency towards creating an egalitarian society existed in the ancient Greek world even among the most talented of the aristocracy, such as the poet Hesiod and the philosopher Plato? The answer is twofold. Firstly, and most importantly, there is a desire for oneness which pervades egalitarian and communist thinking. This is because when the souls came down from the higher worlds into our material world, it led to the feeling of missing the higher world. They made stories of a golden age when men walked with God. This was a memory of a time before we entered into the material plane, subject to all the laws of alienation from the whole and change. This is the law of individualism, the most natural state to beings who live on this plane. And when this is realized, it can be explained why this tendency exists towards wanting to rejoin with the all or with the one, which is just two ways of saying the same thing. The problem with this is that it could lead to misguided attempts to try and recreate this state of being in the material world. And this is where the commune comes from. The instinct towards collectivism comes from wanting to return to the one. But this is impossible. It is better to exist as individuals and create reasonable hierarchies, such as dukedoms, kingdoms, and counties, rather than flirt with anarchistic or quasi-anarchistic states, such as democracies or Marxist-Leninist states. Even fascist states made appeals to egalitarianism and collective action. Christianity strengthened this tendency and gave it form. This tendency already existed in the human psyche, though, and that is why Christianity spread so far without always having to forcibly convert people in all instances. There is a difference between the two desires for anarchy. One is rooted in individualism and the desire for freedom, and can be healthy, while the other anarchistic impulse is rooted in a desire for equality, and taking from others what you wish you had. It is rooted in spite and hatred for those who are naturally superior or higher up in the hierarchy. The monastic orders in the Christian world have a dual soul to them, because on the one hand, they are used for contemplating God and trying to achieve oneness in the soul, while on the other hand, they are rooted in the jealous tendency, since Christ did glorify poverty. As seen in the famous Eye of the Needle quote, Quote, "And again I say to you, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God." End quote. Matthew 19:24. You don't see this with Buddhist monasteries or Hindu yogis. For them, there is no jealous impulse. This is important because the jealous impulse gives you a stronger ego, which is a major blockage to achieving oneness with divinity, because it roots you in hate-filled petty squabbles between humans. The modern communist movements are the opposite of the monastic Buddhist movements in many ways, because they have the opposite tendency, which is that while the Buddhist monks don't have the jealous tendency motivating their asceticism, instead they just have the desire for oneness. The modern communist movements have jealousy and spite as motivators for their desire to collectivize and live communally. Yet they still moralize even though their morality is simply based in jealousy and hatred and spite. Outsiders see them and are sympathetic because they see the familiar ascetic movements from centuries past. But this is dearly mistaken. All they really are is a group of thieves who desire nothing more than to tear down all hierarchies, regardless of whether they are truly unjust or not. For them, there is no such thing as a good king or a tyrant king. For them, all kings are tyrants because all hierarchy is tyrannical. Communist ideology can essentially be described as pseudo-asceticism, because in true asceticism, such as Buddhist asceticism, there is no feeling towards power or money, and no hate, like in Christian monasticism. It is not surprising that capitalists and communists team up so much, because they both have this in common. But the origin of Marxism and the reason for why it is still so attractive to so many people to this day is because it combines the elements of oneness and poverty glory. This is something it inherits from Christianity, and this is the true nature and core of Marxism. As a side note, Marxism can also be described in a few other ways. As a materialist corruption of Hegelian futurism. Hegel himself was a spiritual aesthetic futurist. Also, it's worth mentioning their vision of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat having a final revolutionary battle where the proletariat overthrows the bourgeoisie, that is. It can also be described as a messianic millenarian doomsday cult, obsessed with the last battle. Also, it's worth mentioning eco-Marxism and how it adjusted Marx's belief in a future where everyone lived on industrial communes and replaced it with non-industrial communes. And it also has to do with the Marxist misunderstanding of hunter-gatherer societies. The truth is that hunter-gatherer societies were far more hierarchical with their tribal elders, chieftains, and shamans, and far less egalitarian than Marxists tend to think they were. And finally, it is worth noting that bureaucracy has a communistic tendency to it. It parallels quite a bit with anarchist communes, because there is a tendency of, quote, to each their own, where nobody ever gets fired and the people who do a lot of work are de-incentivized because of no reward, while those who do little never get fired and are always provided for. Thanks for listening. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. That's all for now.